Excited to be here today with everyone to talk about ChatGPT prompts for admins. My name's Tom Hoffman. I'm a practice lead at Crow. I'm also a five-time Salesforce MVP, community group user, and just general AI enthusiast. So really looking forward to talking about ways that you can use ChatGPT as part of your everyday job function, and digging a little bit deeper into some ideas around responsible use and concerns and risk before we get into all the fun stuff that you can do. So the goals for our time together, I do want to establish some ground rules around responsible use, and we'll spend a good bit of time talking about that because I think with something as transformative as AI, we do have to have a rule book for how we're engaging with this new technology, and we'll dig in a little bit deeper into areas around ethics, risk, privacy concerns, and things like that. From there, we'll transition and we'll get into the fun stuff. I'll show you examples of how I interact with ChatGPT and really in three areas. One around knowledge building, the other technical support, and then the last one, functional prompts that help me do my job faster. This slide is going to feel just a little bit redundant, and it's sort of to make a point in that redundancy. And so, if you're an admin or developer, you know there are ways that you can use Chat GPT to be even more awesome at your job. If you're a consultant, there are ways that you can use Chat GPT to be even more awesome at your job. And for both of those groups, before you do, you really should be discussing it with your manager, your company, your clients, or your firm. Because if you hadn't had those conversations, there are security, privacy, ethical concerns that you really should be taking into consideration to make sure you're operating on the right side of company policy, client expectations, and things like that. Now, if you're listening to this and you happen to be a people leader or manager, your people are using ChatGPT. And so if you don't have a policy or you don't have any sort of guidance in place, that really should be a priority because this technology is being adopted faster and faster. And there's things that you need to be on top of as a leader of people so that you can advise them correctly on how to be using this technology. So I think this next question is one that whether you are a policy maker or whether you're someone that needs to, or we can inform a policy or follow policy, is one that we all have to ask. With something as new and different as AI and GPT technology, uh, how do we even create a policy? What guidelines? What are the things that we should be considering as we look at setting the rules for our users? So we actually just asked ChatGPT, and the answer it gave was pretty good. I think just in general, as we're thinking about this, while the power and efficiency of ChatGPT is certainly amazing, you have to be operating within a sort of local governance, risk, and control frameworks at your organization. Absent a formal policy, um, I think this presents an opportunity for everyone here to be a thought leader and help define acceptable use case and frame the conversation around AI in your workplace. And then where policies already exist and there may be a rule book, you can also have input in that and how it changes or how you can be input to have the voice of the end user inside of those policies. So I've taken ChatGPT's response and broken it out into really two areas, the foundational things that you need to do to gather background, and then how do you enact and make sure that that policy, actually has benefit over time. So from the foundational standpoint, you really have to define the purpose of ChatGPT for your organization. And so identifying how are people going to be using it, what are the benefits of it, how is this going to allow us to serve our purpose, our mission, our organization, our customers, our clients better. Within there, you have to identify acceptable use cases, and that's, what are the specific uses for your employees or members of your organization that fit within your company's risk and security posture? What are things that are going to be allowed or considered acceptable use? And then from there, you really have to identify those hard limits. At my own organization, you know, entering customer data into an AI tool is strictly forbidding. Or maybe you want to limit who can use AI as part of their role to certain roles. Once you've determined all of those limitations, you want to document and create that policy and provide training on that policy to everyone at your organization. Now, the next part is really critical. Just because you tell people this is how and this is our policy, ChatGPT is really cool. And so people are going to be pushing the limits and trying to find ways to gain even more efficiency and do things differently with their job. And so I think it's important to monitor usage and to conduct user interviews. And a big part of that and getting people to be transparent and really tell you how they're using the platform is making sure that they know it's a safe space and saying, hey, if something you're doing we determine is later outside of the policy, it's okay. We need this information to make sure that we're operating in a way that we're safe and comfortable with. And that really feeds into the last point. This technology is changing so quickly. I mean, what we're seeing from the time that GPT-4 was released and all of the innovations that are now happening and how many people are working it into their products, it's going to keep expanding. The model's going to keep learning and gaining new capabilities. So this is a policy that's going to need to be constantly evaluated and updated. So as you're looking at using ChatGPT for specific Salesforce tasks, it is another important consideration to think about some of the ethical concerns, some of the risk, and some of the limitations of the tool. And I think that's the most important thing, is to recognize that ChatGPT is a tool. It's not an easy button that will give you all the answers. In fact, without having sufficient knowledge of the Salesforce platform, ChatGPT and other AI tools can actually be pretty dangerous for an org, or for really for any purpose. And that's because ChatGPT is a really good con man. You know, the answers it gives are so convincing and presenting with such authority that without having that underlying platform knowledge, you may not realize that some of the answers that it's providing are not accurate. And we'll go through a lot of examples today that actually show where ChatGPT gets it mostly right, but not quite right, or in some cases, just outright wrong. Um, from there, we think about the ethical concerns. You know, if you're using ChatGPT to check your work or to offer ideas, that's great. But if you're copying and pasting things from ChatGPT and then claiming that work directly as your own, well, that's a deceptive practice. And that really becomes interesting when you think about, this particular use case. You're asked to create documentation around certain technical tasks in Salesforce, creating users, assigning permission sets, or something like that to develop new admin training materials. Well, rather than writing and creating things in your own words, you go into ChatGPT and say, hey, create technical documentation on these topics. ChatGPT knocks it out in 30 seconds. You copy and paste it, format it, you're done in an hour. You were assigned 8 hours to create this documentation. So for the last 7 hours, you're like, I'm good. Or if you're in consultant and you were assigned 4 hours for that task, and although it was done in 30 minutes, you go ahead and bill the client 4 hours. I think that's one of the main concerns, just like in academia, of claiming effort as your own that was really produced by AI. And I think that's a really murky area that we have to make sure that we're avoiding. And that sort of bleeds into the next point. Don't use ChatGPT to outsource yourself. You have to be sort of in charge and using this tool to make yourself maybe more efficient or to improve your knowledge or help with troubleshooting, but it's not a replacement for you. And that builds into the last point, whether it's with your internal work or whether it's with client work or any of the other situations. If you're using AI to support your work, you really have to communicate that to others and let them know. Some of the risks that present themselves, and this is where it gets particularly fun. I actually asked ChatGPT because it says that it anonymizes data and keeps everything perfect. When I asked it about creating a policy, it mentioned specifically creating policies around data privacy. And I said, well, if you anonymize and protect data, why do they need to create a policy around data privacy with ChatGPT? And the answer was pretty remarkable. It actually said, just because I have controls in place doesn't mean I'm infallible. And it says, while ChatGPT is designed to protect data, I'm not 100% foolproof. And so the tool itself acknowledges that there is always a risk that data could be exposed or compromised, especially if that system is targeted by a determined attacker who's trying to get into the the back end and access all of the data that's driving its model. Some other concerns that can be out there around like compliance, depending on the industry or your jurisdiction, there may be legal or regulatory requirements that companies have to follow to protect sensitive data. You think about GDPR, and it requires companies to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure the security of personal data. Well, one of those, GDPR and entering specific personal data into Chat GPT could run afoul of that compliance framework. This last one is really interesting, and that is the information that you provide into the model is actually used to change the model. And so if you ask ChatGPT itself, how do you use the information that I give you? It'll tell you, well, there's 7 different ways, and one of which the answers and your upvotes or downvotes on a response, or telling it it's incorrect and giving it your suggested correct response, it would actually adopt that into the model, and it'll change the way it answers things in the future. So that introduced the idea of people who use it to do engineered phishing attacks or even social engineering, where you're sort of training the model to really present harmful information or to repeat harmful themes out into the world. Okay. All right. So we're going to transition away from the heavy stuff. And I appreciate you sort of indulging me in that conversation. I am really excited about this next part because ChatGPT has such the ability to do some fun things in how we work. But for me, it all has to be set against this backdrop of doing so responsibly and honestly. And really, it's because we want to use it in a manner that encourages its adoption. And we don't want to put our employers or our clients or other companies into a place where they feel they have to enforce strict measures against it. So before I get into all the fun stuff and how I use it and how beneficial it can always be, I always like to spend enough time making sure that we're, thinking about the responsibility that we have to use it appropriately. So on to the good stuff. Before we get into the prompts, I want to share some tips and just my thoughts on how to write effective prompts. And the first one is to understand that it is a conversation. You've heard me and say when I'm talking with ChatGPT, I actually feel like I'm having a conversation. Yes, I know it's not a real sentient person, but there is a back and forth that happens. And that allows ChatGPT to draw on prior answers and expand. And so you'll see examples today where I say, hey, can you actually clean that up? Or can you clarify something that you mentioned there? And in some instances, I say, hey, you actually got that wrong. Can you change your response to incorporate this and this instead? And it will take all of that and the prior answers from pretty far up in a conversation and then change its answers. Small details actually have a pretty significant response on the answer that you get from ChatGPT. And I'm going to show you an example today of where 2 words definitely changed the outcome that I got. And so a good idea is to try different combinations of words and when you're writing your prompts and see how that changes the answers that you get. And both of those points really feed into the last one. I have found that it's better to start wider on a topic and then narrow in versus coming at it very on the nose. By starting a little bit wider and asking a broader topic, it tends to produce a really good wide ranging response. And then you can pick segments in there and say, oh, hey, can you explain that more? Or can you actually add this concept into your response? And then it creates an even more robust answer. Sometimes when I enter prompts to come at it very, very squarely, the answers, it actually parrots back things at me. It takes the words that I gave it and just sort of repeats them back in a better sounding way. And we'll see an example of that in just a couple slides here. So the first category of prompts that we're going to look at are what I call knowledge building prompts. I've been working with the Salesforce platform for a little over a dozen years, and I still run into products, features, and concepts where my knowledge isn't as deep. And sometimes I just don't have my own words to accurately explain a concept, or maybe I'm looking to gain some new information about something I already do know well. So I call these knowledge building prompts because they don't solve a particular challenge or assist maybe necessarily with a functional task that I'm trying to complete, but they do provide a quick assist in finding information to shore up my Salesforce foundation, and it's a lot faster sometimes than using Google or combing through help articles. And so, a few examples that we'll go through. One is explaining the theory of least privilege as it relates to Salesforce security, and then I'll actually ask it to expand on that and to dig in a little bit deeper based off of using permission sets and permission set groups instead of profiles. The next one is one that is a good example of me getting a little bit deeper on something that I know how to use, and configuring them is no issue. But what are the benefits of owner versus criteria based sharing? Which one is more efficient? What are the indications of using one versus another? And we'll get to see some of the rationale that it provides. And then this next one is, explaining lookup skew in Salesforce. This is a pretty challenging topic, or maybe you want to explain to a lay team, someone that's not technical. Hey, we have to take action because lookup skew is going to be an issue, and we'll see how it does a good job with summarizing that information. And this last one was one I ran into. I actually had someone ask me, "Should we be considering Shield?" And I was like, that's a great question. Let me go ask my friend ChatGPT, and it gave me 6 really key valid points to look at to sort of frame that conversation. So we'll jump over to ChatGPT and actually take a look at the response of these prompts. Unfortunately, with ChatGPT, and you're going to see this repetitively on the next couple of screens, is it always starts at the bottom of the screen, and so we have to scroll up and then work our way down. So the first question, this is an example of I came at this very narrowly at the beginning. And I said, can you explain the theory of least privilege as it relates to Salesforce security, with an emphasis on using permission set groups, essentially? And the answer that I got was not that great. It sort of gave me a narrative response. It parroted back my information. And so I pulled back. Hey, can you just explain the theory of least privilege as it relates to Salesforce security? And you can see that pulling back, look at the answer that I got, completely different. And it goes into the separation of profiles, permission sets, role hierarchies, field level security, record level security, right? So all of a sudden I have this very rich answer that up here, all I got was a parroting back of information. So now, starting from this wider view, I'm able to say, hey, can you expand on that prior answer with really planning for permission set groups? Certainly. And so now the answer that I've got is actually what I was looking for in the beginning. So, hey, look at these roles and functions, create permission sets, that are built around those roles and functions, and define those permission sets into groups and assign them to users. This is actually exactly the information that I was looking for. And by asking my question sort of too on the nose initially, it wasn't able to produce that response. So this is both an example of sort of ChatGPT parroting back to us, and also why we sometimes better to start wide and then narrow in. Some of the other prompts that we talked about on that first, the knowledge building ones. Here is where I asked it to compare and contrast criteria versus owner-based sharing rules in Salesforce. And it does a really good job of looking at the benefits of each, in terms of flexibility, scalability, easier maintenance. In the case of the owner base, one I hadn't really thought about was how it creates hierarchical access. Wasn't something I had necessarily thought of, and was a good way to expand my knowledge. But the thing that I'm really curious about is which one's faster. And so it actually goes through and will give you a breakdown of why owner based are generally more efficient than criteria based. And it was an interesting read because for me, I generally lean towards criteria based sharing rules over owner based, just because they can be more targeted. So this is a good example of just sort of it's built my knowledge on that topic and allowed me to sort of get deeper on it. The last couple prompts asked it to explain lookup skew. Does a really good job. it's very wordy, it's very verbose. And so when I say, hey, can you just summarize this for an executive audience, it shortens those responses, puts it more out of technical terms into more conversational terms. And it's a good example of it building off of a prior response. And the last one, and this, should I consider adopting Shield? What better way? Just, hey, ChatGPT, I don't know. Should we? What are the indicators here? And it actually broke out 6 very valid points to consider. Do you have compliance requirements? What's the sensitivity of the data that you have? What are your requirements around field level encryption? Where are there any performance considerations? Do you have key management policies? And the last one being cost. So I thought it was a very good way for me to frame a conversation around the person that asked. So flip back now and we'll talk about our slides here. We'll go back to our next round of prompts. And these are the ones that are troubleshooting or technical ChatGPT prompts. And one thing that I've found very helpful, I'm not a developer, and while I can write SQL queries and sometimes I get some of the clauses wrong, or where I'm trying to find things that start with something, I'll get some of the syntax incorrect. So for me, it's always easy to just jump into ChatGPT and say, hey, can you fire off that SQL query for me? It takes 30 seconds, and so far it hasn't provided me with any wrong answers. I like writing really long, fun formulas, and I have an example of one that's about a page long, but sometimes you sort of lose track of a fun syntax error and you can't find it in that formula, and you start to get cross-eyed staring at the screen for a very long time. Show you an example of just dropping that into ChatGPT and it helping me find the issues. Same with validation rules. If you're struggling with drafting one, or you want to make sure that it does a specific task, and this is actually a great example that I'll show you of, one, ChatGPT getting the answer wrong, and two, ChatGPT actually learning over time from me telling it it's wrong. It no longer gives the wrong answer, and now gives us the correct answer. So it shows that it's learning. And then the last one, I'll show you another example of parroting and not actually being helpful. So we'll pivot back to ChatGPT here. So the first one is where I asked Salesforce for some help with a formula. So I was writing this formula. I was trying to take a date timestamp and create a text string while also modifying it for daylight savings time in a particular time zone. And it's a pretty complex formula, and I was really struggling with finding the error because I was getting the dreaded missing parentheses message. And my eyes were sort of going cross looking for the error. And dropped this in, asked it for an assist, and it was able to look at the formula, and it was able to say, hey, in this particular string, you're missing a closing parenthesis. And then in this particular string, you're also missing another closing parenthesis. And so definitely able to shortcut and help me narrow in, because if you look up here, there's a lot of closing parentheses. So trying to find which particular one was missing was becoming a bit of a chore. I also wanted to say, hey, what was that formula trying to accomplish? Now, I wrote it, so I knew what it was trying to accomplish, but I was trying to just get an understanding of how well it understood the intent of what I was trying to do. It actually did a pretty good job of breaking out the different functions in the formula and identifying what each piece of it was doing. So I think this is a really cool tool if you're coming into an org that maybe isn't well documented, or you're coming into an environment where you're trying to assist someone, but you weren't the one who actually authored the Apex class, or you didn't author the formula or validation rule. You can drop it into ChatGPT and say, hold on, what is this trying to do? Or what's the purpose of this particular thing? And it'll do a good job of summarizing it. The next one is probably one of my most frequent use cases. Whenever I'm trying to write a query, I can write queries, but I sometimes get tripped up on some of the functions and some of the syntax. And so rather than having to worry about getting any of those dreaded red error messages, I just come over here, tell ChatGPT what I want, spits out a SQL query, and so far they've all been correct. So definitely a nice technical shortcut that you can use with ChatGPT. The same exists for validation rules. And, in this one, I say I need a validation rule to keep users from changing something on an opportunity after it's closed. And you can see it spits out that validation rule. But this is also an example of where it doesn't always get everything right. And so you will see here it's using the is_pic_val stage name closed. But when I used to ask it this question, it gave a completely different answer. And it actually recommend using the is_one or is_closed values. Now, Salesforce best practice, because of order of execution, says that using is_one or is_closed in validation rules is not recommended because sometimes your validation rules won't fire. And so I was actually able to tell ChatGPT that, like, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. And it's really funny. We talk about parroting, and it says, hey, Salesforce best practice suggests avoiding the use of is_one field in validation rules. And I find that comical because I was like, well, if you actually knew that, why did you recommend it the first time? But this is an example of I've told ChatGPT multiple times as I've been demoing this to people that this is wrong, this is wrong. And now in the answers that it provides, it no longer uses is_one or is_closed. So it's taken the information that I've been given it over the sort of weeks and months that I've been playing with this, and it's no longer offering that response when I ask. So I'm doing this for a good reason, and trying to correct it. But you can also see how people can feed ChatGPT wrong information, and because it essentially parrots back information and convincingly so, people can get the wrong answers, and so it's one of those things that you have to have the underlying knowledge to use this effectively. All right, and the last prompt I wanted to share is an example of where ChatGPT sort of parrots back information, and doesn't give you any real answer. And so in this case, I was asking about a user that was receiving insufficient access rights error when hitting save on an opportunity. And what was interesting is when I asked that question without all these additional details, it told me I should check, data access, on the opportunity object, the permissions, field level security, all these different places. So I amended my question to say, okay, so a user is getting this error, and I've already checked all of these things. Is there something else that I should check? And if you look at the answer, it says, well, if you've already checked all of these things, and then it basically has you go recheck all of those same things, or things that would have already been implied by the answer that you gave. In this case, page layouts would have nothing to do with someone receiving an insufficient access rights error. Validation rules wouldn't throw an insufficient access rights error. And so there's a bunch of things in here that you would be checking if you just went here and you didn't have any other sort of background knowledge. It would be sending you in a lot of wrong directions in order for you to try and troubleshoot this error. So this is a good example of parroting and why it's important to have a really strong platform knowledge. So we'll head back to the slides, and we're going to cover sort of this last group of prompts, which I refer to as functional prompts. So I call these functional prompts because they really just help me do my job a little bit faster. And one, I give it a really robust example of 3 different groups and ask for help in creating a sharing model. The next one, I ask to give me a hand outlining a flow. The next one, sometimes I spend too much time drafting emails, and ChatGPT is wonderful at that, at sort of expediting that for me. In this case, you'll see it's a kind of an entertainingly aggressive response that I asked it to sort of walk back a little bit. And then the last one, a topic that I'm pretty passionate about, is flow design, and I'm a big fan of the one flow per object per event model, where others like to use multiple record trigger flows with entry criteria. And so I just say, what are the benefits or drawbacks of each one so that I can strengthen my argument whenever I'm engaging in that fun debate. And so switching back to the prompts here. I gave it this group of 3 users, and I just said, hey, group A needs the ability to edit things they own. Group B should be able to view all but not edit. And group C should only be able to view opportunities once they're won. but only edit a few fields. And this is an example of where I said small differences have a big impact. The first time I asked this question, it gave a pretty good answer, but it completely left out the org-wide defaults needing to be private. So I added these two phrases or two words in here, and now the answer actually led off with the org-wide default needs to be private. It goes into group A and it says, here's here are the rules, and here's, create profiles, and it does a pretty good job of walking through the answer. And it definitely gives me a starting point when you're thinking about how to design a security model. Same thing for a flow. Now it's not going to write a flow for you. In this case, I said, hey, I need a flow that will find invoice records related to an opportunity. And as it started going through, one of the things it had me do was within a loop use the get records element. Now, that's an example of doing a DML statement inside of a loop and flow, which we all know is not a best practice. And so I was able to correct it and say, hey, can you use the in function to improve that last response to remove gets and queries inside of loops? And even with my typo, first it apologized, which I appreciate. Hey, we're not perfect, but you're right, which I appreciate even more. Using the in function can help optimize the flow. And so it goes back through and it says to assign from that collection the IDs to a text collection and use the in function to do the next query. So this is just another example of why it's important to have a really good background on the platform when using ChatGPT, because the answers it gives are not always going to follow best practices, and you have to be the one to understand that. And this is an example of where it takes me forever to write emails or to sort of provide an initial draft of language. And so this is an example that I use all the time and recommend other people do. It's a great starting point for writing email templates. And so you can give it the object in which fields that you're wanting to include, and it'll spit you out an email template. It'll put in the field tags, and it'll give you a very good draft of an email that you want to send out. If for some reason there's some language that you don't necessarily want it to use, you can tell it to, hey, make it more formal, make it less formal, and it'll iterate on that and give you another version of it that you can use. And then the last one, as I mentioned, what are the benefits and drawbacks of one flow approach to another? And it does a very good job. And looking through this answer, it was largely correct. And so, one record trigger flow per object model, the simplicity, reusability makes a lot of sense, but some of the drawbacks could be on the flow complexity over time, scalability over time, that one flow can get very large. And that's, particularly where multiple record trigger flows per object shine, providing clear separation and specificity. But the drawbacks are there's a lot more that you need to manage and a lot of issues or more issues from the maintenance side. So it does a very good job of summarizing the arguments both for and against and allowing people to have a good understanding of why they might use one versus another. And that's what I have. And so want to thank you for listening in today. And just to sort of wrap up, it's a really exciting time to be adopting AI into your daily tasks. And just as a reminder, as you go and start using ChatGPT, to make sure that you're doing so above board with your clients or your organization or company, that you're practicing responsible and ethical use, and being creative and using all the different ways that you're learning to use AI to benefit your job and your role, and sharing that back into the community. So thanks again and have a wonderful day.
Thanks for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so let us know what you're thinking in the comment section below. If you want to learn more, head on over to admin.salesforce.com. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, subscribe, and follow us for more.